Between 1835 and 1840, a region of Brazil lost 30,000 to 40,000 people, not to a plague, not to a famine, but to systematic killing carried out by its own government. That's roughly 30 to 40% of the entire population of Pará province, gone in under 5 years. Proportionally, this death toll compares to the Black Death in medieval Europe, one of the worst population collapses in recorded history. Yet most people outside Brazil have never heard of it, and even inside Brazil, it is barely taught in schools. The event was called the Cabanagem, and for nearly 2 centuries, the Brazilian Empire worked very hard to make sure history forgot it ever happened. To understand what happened, you need to picture what the Amazon region looked like in the early 1830s. Brazil had technically gained independence from Portugal in 1822, but for the people living in Pará, that independence changed almost nothing about their daily lives. The region was controlled by a small class of white colonists who owned the land, ran the trade, and commanded the military, while the vast majority of the population had no power at all. That majority was made up of indigenous Amazonians from dozens of distinct nations, mixed-race caboclos, people of mixed indigenous and Portuguese descent, and enslaved Africans and their families. The word caboclo comes from the Tupi language and roughly means those who come from the forest, and these were the people the ruling class used for forced labor in rubber, cacao, Brazil nut, and fish industries, taxed and conscripted and subjected to violence with no legal protection and no political voice. Pará's population in the early 1830s was somewhere between 100,000 and 130,000 people, recorded in provincial documents cited by the 19th century historian Domingos Real in his detailed account called Motins Politicos. The name Cabanagem itself comes from the word cabana, meaning hut, because the rebels were the people who lived in the riverside huts, the poorest of the poor, the people the empire only noticed when it needed their labor or their tax. On January 7, 1835, after years of accumulated suffering with no outlet and no justice, they rose up. The initial uprising was fast and violent. Governor Lobo de Souza was assassinated on the very first day. Multiple military officers were killed within hours, and rebel forces numbering in the thousands seized control of Belém, the capital city of Pará. The Cabanagem had 3 successive leaders, each one representing a different piece of what the rebellion was actually about. Felix Melchor came first, a Portuguese-born landowner who initially joined the rebels but quickly revealed he had no real interest in changing the social order that had created their suffering in the first place. He was assassinated by fellow rebels in February 1835, less than 2 months after the uprising began. Francisco Vinagre took power next, a lower-ranked military officer who negotiated with imperial forces and surrendered Belém to the Brazilian Navy in June 1835. But the rebellion was not finished. Eduardo Angelim retook Belém with rebel forces in August 1835 and held it until March 1836 against overwhelming imperial military pressure. Angelim was born in Ceará, was of mixed race, and genuinely represented the caboclo and indigenous people at the heart of the uprising. He survived the war and lived until 1882, dying an old man, but the people who had fought alongside him were not so fortunate. Because when the Brazilian imperial government sent someone to restore order in Pará, they sent Francisco José de Andrea, and what followed was not a pacification campaign, it was a massacre. Andrea arrived as military governor of Pará in 1836, and his tenure through 1839 coincides with the deadliest phase of the entire conflict. His suppression strategy was systematic, deliberate, and documented in his own official dispatches sent back to the imperial government in Rio de Janeiro. Entire riverside communities were collectively punished for any rebel activity in their area. Villages that could not prove complete loyalty were attacked, their inhabitants killed or enslaved, their settlements burned to the ground. Armed military columns were sent deep into the Amazon interior specifically to hunt and kill rebel groups, operating with almost no accountability for who they killed. Some of Andrea's own reports acknowledged that the killing was not limited to fighters. Non-combatant men, women, and children were dying in these operations. Surviving Indigenous and Caboclo people from pacified areas were frequently forced into labor on plantations and in extractive industries, the exact same conditions that had caused the rebellion, now enforced under the banner of restoration of order. And then there was the prison ship, a vessel documented in historical records as the Brig Palha, a converted ship used as a floating prison in the tropical Amazon heat. Captured rebels and suspected sympathizers were locked in its sealed lower holds, packed so tightly there was no room to lie down, with almost no food, no water, and no sanitation. In the Amazon heat, inside a sealed hold, people died of suffocation, dehydration, and disease in large numbers. Historical accounts describe prisoners dying in conditions that were, in practical effect, a death sentence from the moment they were brought aboard. The death toll from everything, the rebellion itself, Andrea's suppression campaigns, the prison ship, epidemic disease spreading through displaced populations, and starvation, reached between 30,000 and 40,000 people. Starting from a population of roughly 100,000, Pará lost between 30 and 40% of every living person in the province by 1840. Some specific areas along the lower Amazon and the Rio Tapajos may have lost 60 to 70% of their local population, more than half of every person who had lived there before 1835. The historian Mark Harris, in his English-language study, Rebellion on the Amazon, drew on parish death registers and local records to produce the most rigorous demographic analysis of the mortality available, and his findings support the higher end of these estimates. Now here is where the story takes a different kind of turn, not about the killing itself, but about how the Brazilian Empire made sure history would barely notice. Andrea's dispatches to Rio de Janeiro were remarkably detailed about the scale of killing. He reported the numbers of dead as evidence of effective military service. The imperial government treated those reports as administrative documents confirming a successful mission, not as evidence of a mass atrocity requiring any investigation whatsoever. There was no parliamentary inquiry, no judicial process, and no official acknowledgement that civilians had died as anything other than unfortunate but necessary collateral. The main historical source on the Cabanagem is Domingos Real's multi-volume work, Motins Politicos, published between 1865 and 1890, which documented the rebellion in serious scholarly detail. But Real was a member of the Pará elite himself, and his framing reflected that the rebellion was a tragedy, the rebels were portrayed as primitive and violent, and the suppression was presented as a harsh but necessary step for civilization. The word massacre did not appear in official documents. The word pacification did. The rebels left almost no written records of their own. History was written entirely by the people who survived with power still in their hands. Brazil's national identity in the 19th and 20th centuries was constructed around narratives of Portuguese civilization and gradual racial mixing into a harmonious nation. A story that had no room for a violent, explicitly anti-colonial uprising of indigenous and mixed-race people against white imperial authority. Pará was also geographically and politically peripheral to the Brazilian national centers of Rio de Janeiro and later São Paulo, meaning events that received far less attention in nationally standardized school curricula. The victims were indigenous, mixed-race, and poor, and histories written by and for elite audiences consistently underweighted atrocities against exactly those groups. Proportionally, The Cabanagum's death toll is comparable to the Paraguayan War of 1864 to 1870, which is generally recognized as the deadliest conflict in South American history in that century. The difference is that the Paraguayan War's victims belonged to a recognized national population, while the Cabanagum's victims were a colonial underclass whose deaths were deemed less worth recording. By the raw numbers alone, 30 to 40% of an entire province eliminated in 5 years. The Cabanagum ranks among the worst proportional internal massacres in Western Hemisphere history. Recognition has grown since Brazil returned to democracy in the 1980s. Belém now has a Memorial da Cabanagem, inaugurated in 1985 on the 150th anniversary of the revolt, dedicated to the victims. Scholars like Mark Harris and Brazilian historians, including Magda Rixai, have produced serious academic work that finally treats the Cabanagem as the catastrophe its numbers demand. But in standard Brazilian school curricula, it remains a footnote, if it appears at all. A revolt, an uprising, a disturbance, almost never a massacre, almost never the proportional equivalent of the Black Death, carried out deliberately over 5 years by official military command. The Cabanagem is a case study in how history gets written, not by the people who suffered through it, but by the people who survived it with power still in their hands. If you want to understand another story that was deliberately buried by the people who had every reason to bury it, that video is right here.